Welcome to the 14th and final session of the Sellars seminar. The title of the course is Sellars as Metaphysician, Norms and Nature, Appearance and Reality. In this concluding week, I want to assemble Sellarsian raw materials from the first part of the course to address the relations between norms and nature, appearance and reality in a different way than Sellars himself does, in a conceptually realist way, rather than in the way that he does. The issue that I think has emerged on the appearance-reality dimension from our earlier discussions is the issue of conceptual structure. Kant transmuted the idea, the distinction between appearance and reality, whose home is perceptual appearances, by introducing the idea of specifically conceptual appearances. The idea that concept use in the form of claimables, sayables, thinkables are conceptual appearances raises the issue of whether the reality of which it is an appearance shares that conceptual structure. And if it does not, how we can understand it as even in principle being veridical. The underlying issue, I think, is what I want to call conceptual psychologism. It starts with the sensible, correct insight that to be in conceptual shape is to be fit to serve as or provide reasons. After all, the myth of the given was the thought that something that is not in conceptual shape could do that, could provide reasons, evidence, and so on. And it's also true that the only grip we have on reasons comes from reasoning, something that we do. It's inference in the sense of inferring that explains the inferential relations between premises and conclusion, that is, one claim or set of claims being a reason for or against another, and that conclusion being something that reasons can be given for or against. Reasoning here is something done, an act or a practice, a significance an act can have within a practice. And a natural conclusion is that conceptual content is role in those practices of reasoning. And this is the origin of psychologism about the conceptual. The idea that only what plays a suitable role in practices of giving and asking for reasons can be understood to be in conceptual shape. This conceptual psychologism is one large view kind that Sellars shares with Kant. It's restricting the understanding of what is conceptually contentful to the results of discursive practitioners, thinkers and talkers, applying concepts. For us post-linguistic turn folks, using linguistic expressions. What they apply them to is not to be thought of as conceptually structured or conceptually contentful, apart from what concepts practitioners might apply to it. This is a kind of subjectivism about conceptual content, and it, I think, is what leads to a picture of conceptual appearances of a non-conceptual reality. And this is what I want to call the Kantian problematic. When Kant made, once again, a sharp distinction between perception and conception, between the sensuous and the rational, this is what led to his notion of conceptual appearances. Discursive commitments, judgings, are in conceptual shape, but what they seek to say or think or know about is not in conceptual shape. This commitment of Kant's is turning Plato on his head, at least from Kant's point of view. For Plato had non-conceptual, sensuous appearances of a conceptual reality. But for Kant, reality as it is in itself, the topic, ultimately, of our reasoning practices, neither provides nor stands in need of reasons in reasoning practices. And Sellars is with Kant on this point. he sees conceptual appearances of a non-conceptual reality. And as far as that goes, my Dr. Vater Rorty is entirely with Kant and Sellars on this point. For Rorty, the alternative would be to think of nature's own language, and he always uses that phrase in a derisory fashion. So this is the Kantian problematic, the problem of making sense of conceptual appearances of a non-conceptual reality. It's not forced upon us. In McDowell's masterpiece, Mind and World, he botanizes various pathologies that result from conceiving the world we know of and act in, the natural world, as not already in conceptual shape before cultured knowers address it. McDowell's view is that, as he puts it, the conceptual has no outer bound. There can be language entry and exit transitions, but those are not to be understood as transitions in and out of the conceptual realm. What Sellars calls the world in the narrow sense, the world independently of any relation to discursive practitioners, is just the natural world. And it's to be construed privatively as what's reference independent of culture, what we institute by talking. And Mind and World asserts the unboundedness of the conceptual as a way of evading the Kantian problematic, with its two alternatives of transcendental idealism and subjective idealism. This is a return to Aristotle, where rational forms occur in nature and in minds, just different modes of mattering them. So a third way is to embrace conceptual realism, while rejecting the restriction of the reason relations that articulate conceptual contentfulness to reasonings. To make that work, one's going to need a non-psychological, non-subjective, non-pragmatic understanding or conception of the conceptual, in the sense that it must not restrict what's conceptually structured to discursive practices and their products. So we need a non-psychological conception of the conceptual. We might have to explain what the conceptual is by appeal to concept use in judgment, to reasoning. But we might say that only shows the sense dependence of the notion of conceptual content on discursive practice. It doesn't show that conceptual contentfulness is reference dependent on discursive practice, that in a world that had no discursive practitioners, it would not be intelligible to talk about conceptual structure anywhere else. The variety I'm going to elaborate is a structural, rational conception of the conceptual. I'm concerned to show that we can agree that conceptual content is role in reason relations, and that the grip we have on the notion of reason relations comes from their role in normatively structuring reasoning practices, but that once we do have a grip on the concept of reason relations, we can see that it extends farther than those reasoning practices. So I'm suggesting that we give up the notion of conceptual realism. We give up the notion of conceptual psychologism in favor of a kind of conceptual realism. Now, this isn't the only possible connection. If you hold on to conceptual psychologism and restrict the conceptual to thinkings, to representings, the things that can be put forward as premises and conclusions of inference, but you're also a conceptual realist. That is, you see the things that we're reasoning about the things we're representing, the things we're describing, as also in conceptual shape, the result is a Berkeleian subjective idealism. That's the view that the objective world consists exclusively of thinkings or representings, the representings of some world thinker, the one who is thinking the world. That's what you get if you combine conceptual psychologism with conceptual realism. If you don't, if you reject conceptual realism, then you get transcendental idealism. That combines conceptual psychologism with the rejection of conceptual realism. That's the picture of conceptual representations, conceptual representings, appearances of non-conceptual represented reality. Conceptual realism without conceptual psychologism, well, that's the basic idea of Hegel's absolute idealism. And I want to fill in a version of such an account that I'll call bimodal structural conceptual realism. Sellars, I think, gives us two sorts of clues about a non-psychological conception of the conceptual. His appeal to situation in a space of subjunctively robust implications as functionally defining conceptual content. He was defining conceptual content as descriptiveness in the declarativist sense of whatever we can use to make a claim. Whatever is truth evaluable, he says, we can make sense of that only by understanding it as situated in a space of subjunctively robust implications. That's in CDCM. Second is his nomic pronouncement that the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. And I think if we put those two ideas together, we get something I'm going to call bimodal conceptual realism. For the conceptual realism, we appeal to the first of Sellars' lessons and look to reason relations of implication or consequence on the one hand and incompatibility on the other as functionally defining conceptual contentfulness. That's rational structuralism or functionalism about the conceptual. I'm just going to call those reason relations, and for the moment, I'm just asserting that there are two flavors of them, implication and incompatibility. And for the bimodal part, we're going to appeal to Sellars' second lesson and think of the use of concepts by discursive subjects in normative, that is, deontic modal terms, but as corresponding to the conceptual structure on the objective side of reality that's articulated in alethic modal terms, in subjunctively robust relations of consequence and incompatibility. So putting them together, what's articulated by relations of consequence and incompatibility is conceptually contentful. And that can be either consequence and incompatibility understood in normative terms or as understood in modal terms. So, I mentioned Hegel a minute ago. His fundamental metaphysical notion is negation, but it's not simple negation. He calls it determinant negation. It's something like Aristotelian contrariety, exclusive negation, he'll sometimes say, negation in the sense in which the negation of something else precludes. So mere negation, mere difference is the difference between red and circular. Those are different properties, but they're compatible properties. But the relation between circular and square That's exclusive difference, incompatibility. It's impossible that anything should be both red and square. But it's crucial that even though in the objective world we have incompatible properties, the coin's being copper and it's being an electrical insulator. Those are incompatible properties. It's impossible that the coin should have both of those properties. But we can see a sense of incompatibility that applies to our commitments. My commitment that the coin is made of copper and my commitment that it's an electrical insulator are incompatible. Not now that it's impossible that one subject should have both commitments, the way it's impossible that one object should have both the property of being copper and of insulating. No, it's not impossible for me to undertake incompatible commitments. It's just wrong. I'm making a mistake if I do that. The incompatibility is normative. I can't be entitled to both of those commitments. So I quoted the CDCM passage. We have to locate items in a space of implication in order to understand conceptual contentfulness. He also says in the early piece, Inference and Meaning, Kant was on the right track when he insisted that just as concepts are essentially and not accidentally items which can occur in judgments, so judgments and indirectly concepts are essentially and not just accidentally items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. That's the notion I'm trying to make sense of. Now, what I'm suggesting with this bimodal conceptual realism is an instance of the scholastic maxim that when you're faced with a contradiction, you should make a distinction. Here, the contradiction is the idea of appearances of a non-conceptual reality, which on the one hand are themselves in conceptual shape, and on the other hand are, or at least intelligibly could be, veridical, telling us how things really are. And the distinction we're going to make is between two different kinds of conceptual content, two forms that it can take, well, two ways it can be, that those rational forms, which are conceptual contents, can be and mattered. And they're modally different. It's a lethic modality in the objective world and deontic normative modality in the world of discursive practitioners of subjects. So the idea is we can say, we can be conceptual realists, see conceptual appearances of a conceptually articulated world, while still acknowledging the difference between the subjective and objective poles of that intentional nexus. So let me talk about the representing side, the discursive practitioner's side, the side that this sort of conceptual realist, bimodal conceptual realist, can agree with the conceptual psychological understanding, can agree, here, if anywhere, there is conceptual articulation because there's actual reasoning. And I think the beginning of wisdom in thinking about conceptual contents in discursive practice is a lesson from Gil Harman, one of my teachers, that's been recently followed up in a famous paper by John McFarlane, a proud Pitt product. And this Harmon point is that you have to strictly distinguish reasoning practices from reasoning relations. And he originally makes this argument in the context of a provocative claim that there is no such thing as deductive inference. And the argument's pretty simple. He says, if there were, surely a paradigm would be reasoning from P and if P then Q to Q. If you're committed to P and you're committed to if P then Q, those premises commit you to Q. But he says, that's just not so. That might be at least a bad inference. For you might have much better evidence against Q than you had for P. And in that case, you should reject P. Modus ponens is in there. Deductive logic tells us about the relation between P and if P then Q and Q. But what it's telling us is not what to infer from what, but something about rational constraints on inference. What modus ponens is saying, you must not accept all of P if P then Q and not Q. Or you must not accept P if P then Q and reject Q. That's the meaning of an implication relation codified in the principle of modus ponens, but it only normatively constrains. It doesn't determine proper inferential practice. It's telling us about a rational relation among those claimables, but it's not telling us what to do. It's just normatively constraining them. So I want to think about those reason relations. That's the notion we'd like to get a better grip on, in connection with a simple model of discursive practice, one that I want to claim is a minimal model of discursive practice, in that nothing that doesn't have this, doesn't exhibit at least this structure, deserves to count as a discursive practice, by which I understand a practice that confers on some of its performances the pragmatic significance of claimings in a way that we can see as expressing doxastic commitments, as saying that things are thus and so, what we would express with declarative sentences. So here we could start just to shape our thinking with 5 Sellarsian commitments from the things we read in the first half of the course. First, statements that say what some expression means are what they're doing is classifying the expression functionally according to the role that it plays in some functional system. And second point, in some reflections on language, well, that was from meaning as functional classification. In another essay, the classic Some Reflections on Language Games, he tells us something about the functional system that he has in mind. At its core are language moves, inferential moves. The essence of the argument against the myth of the given is insisting that playing a role in those language moves is essential for the conceptual contentfulness of our states, for something to play an epistemic justificatory role. It has to be located in a network of implications governing those language moves. Third Sellarsian point, the functional system with respect to which we determine the roles that meaningful things, conceptually contentful things, are playing, is in the first instance a normative system rather than a causal or dispositional one. Implicitly, normative practices induce regularities of dispositions. That's an important claim of his. But we start with the normative articulation. Discursive practice is fraught with ought, he says. Fourth is a claim I've mentioned a number of times, that using expressions according to those practically implicit norms, is situating them in a space of implications that at least corresponds to the inferential language moves. And again, he says, grasp of a concept is practical mastery, a kind of know-how or ability. It's mastery of the proper use of expressions. Grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of some expressions. So I think we can put together those clues into a simple model of discursive practice. At its base, discursive practice is what I've described before as a game of giving and asking for reasons. And at its base are activities of asserting and inferring. And I think of these as two sides of one coin. What's assertable is what can play the role both of premise and conclusion in an inference. Without assertions, you can't make sense of inference. Without the inferential relations, you can't make sense of assertions. Asserting, and with it, I want to say denying, I'll call it generically claiming, is taking up a stance or a position in the space of reasons, undertaking a distinctive kind of doxastic commitment. Inferring is giving reasons for and against that kind of commitment, the kind of commitment that you stake out and undertake by claiming, by asserting or denying something that would be expressed by a declarative sentence. This is giving reasons for and against, is making other assertions and denials that entitle you to the stance or preclude you from entitlement to it. Well, what we're interested in to begin with is the relation between implication relations among the conceptual contents expressed by declarative sentences on the one hand, and inferential moves or practices relating the acts of asserting or claiming. Here's a way to think about that. It's reason relations of implication and incompatibility that determine what claimables, assertables, deniables, would provide reasons for and against what other ones. So we're talking about the relation between language inferential moves in a broadly Sellarsian pragmatics on the one hand, and location in a space of implications as distinguishing conceptual declarative description from mere labeling, as he says in CDCM. So the Harmon point tells us to distinguish these. I think we should think of the norms implicit in discursive practice as themselves coming in two flavors. What one is doing in making a claim is undertaking a commitment. That's what the commitments that you can undertake in that way are going to be worthy of being called doxastic commitments, corresponding to beliefs. But one's entitlement, indeed one's rational entitlement to those commitments, is always in principle at risk, always in principle open to question. Discursive practice is essentially, and not just accidentally, to echo Sellars here, a critical rational practice. So when somebody makes a claim, it's liable to be challenged. What's challenged is the speaker's entitlement to that commitment, to that claim. And you challenge by making another claim, producing another performance, performing a claiming that undertakes acceptance or rejection of what's expressed by a declarative sentence. You challenge by making another claim that's related to the first as a reason against it. And you defend your entitlement to the claiming that you've made against a challenge by making another claim, producing another claiming that's related to the first as a reason for it. And basically, discursive practice in this minimal model consists of undertaking commitments and challenging and defending entitlement to them. And the individuals understand what's going on by keeping track of who's committed and entitled to what. And implicit in these practices, then, are two kinds of reason relations: norms for reasons for, and norms determining what's a reason against. And those are implication and incompatibility. And the reason there's two kinds of reason relation is because there's reasons for that are cited in defending claims and reasons against that are cited in challenging them. Now, these shouldn't be understood to be relations of logical implication and logical inconsistency, we could say. They're, in Sellars' terms, material inferential relations that articulate the contents of non-logical concepts such as copper and lion. Indeed, the way I want to tell the story, we introduce logical vocabulary later in the game to make explicit in the form of claimable declarative sentences our commitment to relations of implication and incompatibility. The conditional has the expressive job of making implications explicit in claimable form, and negation has the expressive job of making incompatibilities explicit in claimable forms. Now, Greg Restall and Dave Ripley have given a normative account in a distinctive pragmatic metavocabulary of how we should understand reason relations. The one they mostly are focusing on is implication, but there's corresponding story to be told about incompatibility. Greg Restall initiated this line of thought to make sense of multi-succedent implications in sequent calculi, but that's not, and I mean, it does a wonderful job with that, but that's not the aspect of it that I care about here. He says to say that a set of sentences gamma implies a sentence A, what you're doing when you say that or take that set of premises to imply that conclusion is to take in practice commitment to accept all the premises and a commitment to reject the conclusion, to take that constellation of commitments as being normatively ruled out or out of bounds. You're in a bad place if you accept all the premises and reject the conclusion, if they genuinely stand in an implication relation. And the set of premises gamma is incompatible with the conclusion A in case accepting all of the constellation of commitments that includes accepting all of gamma and accepting A is normatively out of bounds. You've done something wrong, you need to change things. So I think we can understand the role of these reason relations as norms implicitly governing our practices if we think about asserting as essentially coming as part of a constellation of speech acts one can perform. We have the bivalence between asserting and denying, expressing practical attitudes of accepting and rejecting. Those speech acts of claiming involve undertaking commitments whose rational, we can say now, entitlements are potentially always at issue, in the sense that part of this constellation of minimal discursive speech acts includes assertions that relate to other assertions as challenges to them, undercutting the entitlement to those commitments, and defenses, which are other assertions that offer reasons for the commitment that was undertaken, reinstating the entitlement. And I see the general structure here as what I've called a default and challenge structure of entitlement. That is, when you make a claim, there's a default entitlement that comes with it. If you say it's raining, I assume you know what you're talking about, until and unless somebody challenges and says, well, you've been locked in a windowless room. How do you know what the weather is out there? Or does something that puts that entitlement in brackets, pending some defense on your part. And, you and I might keep different books on whether someone has successfully defended against a challenge or whether a challenge was something that somebody was entitled to make. So there are going to be complications even within this simple model. But all I want from it is the picture of how reason relations of implication and incompatibility are related to normative assessments of the propriety or impropriety of constellations of commitments. Which constellations of commitments can you be jointly entitled to and which not? And the basic idea is this Restall-Ripley idea that gamma implying A means that accepting all of gamma and rejecting A is normatively out of bounds. And so for rational critters, a motive to alter something so that one could be entitled to one's commitments. This is the critical rational character of basic discursive practices. And notice that the bivalence of doxastic attitudes of acceptance and rejection, manifested in the bivalence of speech acts of assertion and denial, the two flavors of claiming, together with the essential critical articulation of claimings as such, together entail the dyadic structure, the bivalent structure, we could say, of reason relations, their division into implication and incompatibility relations, the ones providing reasons for and the other reasons against, well, normatively constraining the giving of reasons for and reasons against. And the basic thought behind the structural, rational, non-psychological conception of the conceptual is that conceptual contents are roles in a space articulated by reason relations of these two kinds, implications and incompatibilities. Where we're going, the bimodal picture will be, we can understand those relations of implication or consequence on the one hand and incompatibility on the other, not only in this normative Restall-Ripley sense, but also in alethic modal terms of how things objectively are, independently of anybody's discursive practices. So let me now say something about that, about the objective side of things. One of the most sophisticated, flexible, and expressively powerful formal understandings of conceptual contents that are available today are to be found in Kit Fine's Truthmaker Semantics. So let me say something about that. First, on the side of metaphysics, the universe, the way the world is construed, from which we'll be drawing, well, constructing semantic interpretants of sentences, consists of a collection of what he calls states. Part of the flexibility of the metaphysical part of this is that the apparatus can be quite non-committal about what states are. But it's raining is a paradigm of a state, or it's raining here now, something like that. We really only know two things, or only put two conditions on the worldly states. And the first is a broadly mereological one. Some states are parts of others, or put the same point a different way, states can be combined so that they show up as parts of a new whole. We say that any collection of states can be fused to form a new state, a new whole of which they are parts. And the other thing we say besides this ordering structure or fusing structure, this broadly mereological structure, is that the states are partitioned into possible states and impossible states. So what we're working with is what Fine calls modalized state spaces that have this, that are structured just by this fusion operator. Now, I said this is an expressively powerful framework that Fine has offered us. It's recognizably a successor to possible world semantics, in terms of which we can do good metaphysical things and good semantic things. It's easy to recover possible worlds in the state space framework. World states are possible states that are maximal in the sense that every state is either included in that maximal state or is incompatible with it. That is, fusing that other state with the world state would yield an impossible state. But we have these substates that can be parts of many different world states. These world states are not metaphysically privileged in any way. I mean, they have this feature, but that's just something you can define or discern in the metaphysics. Other than that, they're on a par with other states. Part of the expressive flexibility, both on the metaphysical side, but it shows up particularly in the semantic side of the apparatus, is that there's multiple impossible states. And in effect, in possible world semantics, there's just one. That is, they're the possible state, they're the possible worlds, and everything else is simply impossible, but not distinguished by the apparatus. You can put various structural conditions on the fusion monoid. For instance, one that Fine appeals to is the idea that any state that includes an impossible state as one of its parts is itself impossible. And principles like that, structural constraints, will have both metaphysical implications and semantic implications. Okay, that's the basic metaphysics. Let me talk about semantics. The semantics consists in, for any language, any lexicon, any set of sentences, an interpretation function that assigns to each sentence a pair of sets of states, which are thought of as its exact truth makers or verifiers on the one hand, and its exact falsity makers or falsifiers on the other hand. Now, I say exact because the state that it's reigning exactly verifies the sentence it's reigning. It makes it true. But the state of which that state is a part, the state of its reigning and snow being white, that also verifies the sentence it's reigning. It's raining and snow is white, verifies, makes true the claim that it's raining, but not exactly, because it has this additional component in it, the additional state, snow is white, which is irrelevant to whether it's raining or not. So we have, with each sentence, we associate a set of exact truth makers and a set of exact false makers. Now, we can put structural restrictions on the semantics, on the interpretation function too. For instance, you might think that it would be good to require or to restrict our attention to sentences where the truth makers and false makers don't overlap, where there's no sentence that makes the sentence both true and false. Maybe in some circumstances we don't want to impose that, but we can. Fine urges a stronger condition that for well-behaved, semantically well-behaved sentences, for ones that express a proposition, which maybe we can have sentences that don't, but we can privilege a class where every fusion of any truth maker and any falsity maker of that sentence is an impossible state. If we impose that condition, we can say, well, these are well-behaved meanings, propositions. That's the capacity. He calls that condition exclusivity. Once again, imposing that is going to have effects on our semantics. But we can go back to the metaphysics for a minute, looking back over our shoulders from the semantics. There are way more propositions in the sense of pairs of sets of states that satisfy exclusivity. That is, such that any fusion of an element of the first set with an element of the second set is an impossible state. There are many more of those than we can express in any particular language. Even if the language has a countable infinity of sentences in it, if there's even a countable infinity of states in the objective world, and we might well want there to be an uncountable infinity of them, but even if there's only a countable infinity of them, there's going to be an uncountable infinity of sets of those states, and so of pairs of those states. So we can think about the sayables, the propositions that are out there in the world, the set of pairs of states that are eligible to be verifiers and falsifiers of sentences, whether or not there actually is a sentence in the particular language we're concerned with that can express that has those truth makers and falsity makers. We can see in the world these propositions that are expressible in some language, even though any particular language is only going to express a proper subset of them. Well, finds metaphysics in being modally realistic is conceptually realistic. There's propositions out there, and those propositions stand in relations of consequence and incompatibility, articulated by the possibility and impossibility of states, independently of their semantic expression by some language, according to any interpretation function. Fine mostly confines himself to two notions of consequence. One of them is, he calls entailment. One proposition entails another if every truth maker of the first is a truth maker of the second. Anything that makes the first proposition P true also makes the second proposition, the conclusion Q, true. That's a natural thing to mean by consequence. He has another, interestingly, and this is a measure of the expressive flexibility of the framework. He has another notion of consequence he calls containment, where P implies Q. Q is a consequence of P, just in case every truthmaker of P is contained in a truthmaker of Q. And that interacts with entailment in various ways. And clearly there's a notion of incompatibility. If the truthmakers if every fusion of a truthmaker of P with a truthmaker of Q is an impossible state, then those are incompatible claimables. It's impossible that they should both be made true. No state can do that. So, in Fine's metaphysical universe, there are not only relations of consequence or implication among these propositions, there are incompatibilities as well. That is, his metaphysics has got conceptually contentful propositions standing in relations of implication and incompatibility to one another, where those notions of consequence and incompatibility are defined in alethic modal terms of the possibility and impossibility of states. And all of this is in the metaphysics, independently of what sets of sentences there are with their interpretation functions. I mean, we needed to look at the semantics in order to know what a proposition is, but that's a ladder we can kick away. We can see in the metaphysics claimable, conceptually contentful propositions standing in reason relations to one another, in relations of implication or consequence and incompatibility, and having the contents they do in virtue of inter alia, the reason relations they stand in. So this metaphysical account is conceptually realistic. There's reason relations right there in the objective world, independently of discursive practices, but those reason relations are understood in alethic modal terms rather than in deontic normative terms, as we were doing on the side of discursive practice. So there's a prospect for a bimodal conceptual realism that sees conceptual contents normatively articulated on the side of discursive practice and the giving and asking for reasons, challenging and defending of claimings, altering the commitments and entitlements, those are deontic normative terms, and on the objective side, worldly states out of which we can build, in terms of which we can understand propositions standing in reason relations of incompatibility and consequence to one another, reason relations intelligible as such, as what lets us identify these as reason relations, is the story we tell on the normative side, but the actual existence of these incompatibilities and consequences in the objective world doesn't owe anything to, is not subjunctively dependent on the existence of discursive practices at all. So there's a toy pragmatic story and a sketch of a semantic story, which Fine and his students and admirers have developed to a remarkable extent. even though the original paper is only 2017, it hasn't been that long, but this is a very active area of research. Well, can we fill that in any further? And here, I want to say, yes, we can. And Olaf Wolbel has shown us how to do it. Olaf, who got his Pitt PhD 7 or 8 years ago, teaches at Concordia University in Montreal, working on these things. He realized that Fine has missed a bet in defining consequence the way he does. You might suspect that because part of the flexibility of the truthmaker framework is, I mentioned that it has multiple impossible states as well as possible states, but it also semantically associates with sentences not just a set of truth conditions, but a set of falsity conditions, a set of falsity makers as well as a set of truth makers. And this is important in its being a hyper-intentional semantics, hyper-intentional in that it can assign different semantic interpretants to sentences that are logically equivalent in classical logic. Various De Morgan and distribution principles can fail. You can make sense of these logically equivalent sentences, nonetheless expressing different contents. And an essential element of that is keeping the two sets of books, one on truth makers and one on falsity makers. But that distinction, that bivalence of the semantics is not appealed to in making sense of the reason relations of consequence and incompatibility. So you might think that's not taking full advantage of the apparatus. And Wolbel has a suggestion as to how consequence should be defined, or another richer notion of consequence, how that could be defined in the truthmaker framework. And maybe from the way I've set this up, you can see where I'm going with this. He says, let's think about consequence in the truthmaker framework, where we say gamma implies A in case every fusion of any truthmaker of all the elements in the premise set gamma with a falsity maker of A is an impossible state. Let me repeat that. We're going to look at truth makers of all the premises and falsity makers of the conclusion. And we say, if the fusion of any truth maker of all the premises and any false maker of the conclusion, if that's an impossible state, then gamma implies A. And we'll tell a similar story about incompatibility. Now, it turns out that there are real formal payoffs from using this more articulated notion of consequence that appeals to falsifiers as well as verifiers. Wolbel has shown how you can use that notion to extend the truthmaker framework to deal more smoothly with non-monotonic consequence and logics, non-transitive ones, and use it to interpret things like multiplicative and additive linear logic, and other things that it has not been applied to. But I don't care about the logic here. What I care about is the relation between an understanding of implication or consequence in pragmatic terms, the Restall-Ripley definition, and an understanding of it in truthmaker terms. Remember, Restall and Ripley said gamma implies A in case commitment to accept all of gamma and commitment to reject A put one out of bounds. The state, the position one is in, the normative status one has, if one is committed to accept all the premises and reject the conclusion, that's normatively out of bounds. You can't be entitled to that constellation of commitments. And now Wolbel invites us to see how consequence in objective terms, in the truthmaker framework, that gamma implies A if the state you get by fusing any truthmaker of all of the premises with any falsity maker of the conclusion is an impossible state. Well, those implication relations defined in the Restall-Ripley normative pragmatic way and defined as Wolbel does in the truthmaker framework, those are isomorphic. We've got acceptance and rejection on the normative side. That's taking true and taking false. And we've got verifiers and falsifiers on the truthmaker side. That's making true and making false. And we say this fundamental reason relation of implication or consequence is what you get either when taking true all the premises is combined with a taking false of the conclusion, gives you something that's inappropriate, or when making true all of the premises and making false the conclusion is out of bounds in the sense that it's impossible, is metaphysically out of bounds. This is an isomorphism between the reason relations defined in a normative pragmatic metavocabulary and those same reason relations defined in an alethic modal semantic and metaphysical metavocabulary. And it's a strict isomorphism, at least it can be. Sentences, propositions can stand in exactly the same relations of implication. And as I said, there's a version of this for incompatibility as well. Exactly the same ones. Even though in the side of using them, we're understanding that in normative terms, and in the side of what makes them true, we're understanding that in alethic modal terms. So this is a bimodal, conceptual, realistic picture. If we just define consequence and incompatibility in the right way in the truthmaker framework. Now remember, when Spinoza looked back at Descartes' new notion of representation that he'd introduced, and when Spinoza took the paradigm of that to be Descartes' analytic geometry, the relation between algebraic equations and the geometrical figures that they're equations for, he came to the conclusion that what mattered for representation, and that this was what was special about the new notion of representation, that distinguished it from old models of resemblance of reality by appearance was this global isomorphism that we see between algebraic and geometrical items, where you have to understand the relations among the equations as isomorphic to the relations among the geometrical figures in order to see how this sequence of symbols can be the equation for, can be a representing of a represented circle. There's no resemblance between them, but the roles they play in these larger relational structures, there's an isomorphism and they play the same role. And Spinoza boils this down into the claim that the order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things. And what we're seeing is a version of that conceptually realistic account where there's a system of reason relations, of consequence and incompatibility on the side of the order and connection of ideas in practices of giving and asking for reasons, making claims, asserting and denying claimables, and challenging and defending them, the reason relations of consequence and incompatibility that articulate those doings on the side of representing, of the representings, that can be isomorphic to the reason relations on the objective metaphysical side of possible and impossible states that make true and make false those claimables. And we can see the claimables as potentially we can make sense of them playing exactly the same role with respect to objective alethic modal necessitations and exclusions or deontic normative consequences and exclusions. So Wolbel has shown us this isomorphism. It's a way of working out the bimodal hylomorphic conceptual realism in a way in a way that we can do real semantic and pragmatic work with. I mean, notice, for instance, that this isomorphism between the reason relations, articulated on the one hand in alethic modal terms of possibility and impossibility, and on the other hand in terms of commitment and entitlement, being inbounds and out of bounds, normatively, that isomorphism is at the level of reason relations in the first instance. Only secondarily is it at the level of propositions or claimables, insofar as they are roles with respect to these reason relations. But we can see here how to work out modal realism of fine sort as entailing conceptual realism. If we understand conceptual content in a structurally rationalistic way, where conceptual content is understood as role with respect to reason relations of consequence and incompatibility, then we can see worldly propositions as parallel to the claimables that are asserted and denied in discursive practice. And furthermore, this nice picture is on the pragmatic side, anyway, elaborated entirely from Sellarsian raw materials, even though it leads us to a very different metaphysical picture than he had, because we've jettisoned a psychological understanding of conceptual in terms of reasoning practices for a structural conception of the conceptual in terms of role in reason relations, which we admit reason relations can only be understood in terms of the role they play in reasoning practices. But that's in the order of understanding. We can make perfect sense of the existence of propositions standing in relations of consequence and incompatibility, just in terms of fusions of truth makers and false makers being impossible states, all in the metaphysics, quite apart from whether there are actually any sentences that have those states as exact truth makers and falsity makers. We see this structural parallel between taking true and making true. Each one of them has taking false and making false. The taking true by representing subjects and the making true by the represented world. We can see these as isomorphic, so that it's the very same things that practitioners take true, claim as the content of their assertions, by using them in accord with those reason relations read in the Restall Ripley way. It's the very same things that they take true that the worldly states make true. The very same conceptual contents. We can think of those as rational forms, which can be enmattered either in takings true and false or in makings true and false by worldly states. So that's a kind of neo-Aristotelian view of the sort I gestured at McDowell as recommending, according to this Spinozistic global isomorphism. So now remember, we saw those who have a psychological conception of the conceptual as dividing into two camps. There was the transcendental idealist alternative, developed by Kant and endorsed by Sellars, where conceptual articulation is restricted to the domain of representings, to discursive activity and its products, where transcendental idealism says the world that's represented, what's really out there, independently of our representing of it, that's not in conceptual shape. And if one instead of taking the transcendental idealist line, was a conceptual realist and said, no, the objective world is also in conceptual shape, but if you retain that conceptual psychologism, that psychological conception of the conceptual, that restricts it to representings, then you get Berkeleyan subjective idealism. The world consists of representings, the representings of the world thinker, the thinkings of the world thinker. This is Berkeley, one who Yeats described as God-intoxicated Berkeley, who proved all things a dream, that this great farrowing pig of a world that doth so solid seem would vanish in an instant if the mind but change its theme. Well, Berkeley hasn't had a lot of followers. That combination of a psychological conception of the conceptual and conceptual realism, pretty much cray-cray. And I've suggested in various ways that even Sellars' sort of more up-to-date version of the transcendental idealism, conceptual appearance of a non-conceptual world, his various forms of nominalism, that it's very difficult to tell a story like that coherently, and gestured at McDowell's Mind and World as giving us further arguments that sort of story is not going to work, that we should be conceptual realists, should see the conceptual as unbounded. But if we go bimodal, we can acknowledge the distinction between reason relations in the objective world of possibles and impossibles, and a different modal flavor of them as governing our, as normatively governing our discursive practices, what's appropriate and inappropriate, what commitments you can and can't become entitled to. So we can avoid not only the Berkeleyan mistake, but the distinction that binds Kant to Plato, seeing the appearance-reality distinction as lining up with the conceptual, non-conceptual distinction. And we can do that in granular detail. I said I wasn't going to say anything about the logics, but we can show how to translate soundness and completeness results for a whole range of logics that we can do in the truthmaker framework, that we can also do in sequent calculi that are interpreted according to the Restall-Ripley understanding. I want to close by asking a question about this, I hope you'll agree, pretty isomorphism that we can construct in granular detail. Where does it come from? How is it that there could be an isomorphism between the reason relations that articulate worldly propositions, sets of states on the one hand, and what's expressible by our using sentences in practices of giving reasons for them and against them, normatively governed by relations of implication and incompatibility. Is that just magic? Is it a pre-established harmony? Well, no. And here's something like a punchline. Think of what we were talking about last week. This isomorphism, insofar as it exists, is the product of a distinctive process and practice. It's the practice of applying empirical descriptive concepts. If you think back to last week, I suggested identifying those as ones whose use is, on the one hand, normatively governed by what's described, in the sense that what's described, what's represented in the objective world, serves as a normative standard for assessments of correctness of the empirical description, the representing, as a description of or representation of that represented objective constellation of worldly states. So there's a normative dimension where we assess the correctness, the normative correctness of the describing, using what's described as a normative standard, determining what's correct. And the describings, the representings, empirical describings now and representings, epistemically track in a subjunctively robust way what is being described, what is being represented, those worldly states, in the sense that if the worldly states were different, the commitments that are undertaken would be different. The empirical descriptions that are applied would be different. That's an alethic modal matter of subjunctive dependence of describings or representings on what's represented, in parallel with the normative governance assessing the correctness with what we're talking about, what we're describing empirically, serving as a standard of correctness for assessments of our commitments, which ones we're entitled to. And here, to get a sense of how those empirical descriptive practices can refine and improve the fit of the reason relations in our discursive practice to the reason relations in the objective world as specified in Fine's Metaphysics, to get a sense of how these empirical descriptive properties, with their dual normative and alethic components, the normative governance and epistemic tracking, how they could sand off the rough edges where the reason relations are out of step, refine and improve the fit between them. To get at least a sense of that, we could think back to this example that Sellars raises in one of his early pieces that's come up a couple of times, a toy concept of an acid, where we use it with normative circumstances of appropriate application, that anything that tastes sour is an acid, follows that it's an acid, that implies that it's an acid, and with normative appropriate consequences of application, that anything that's an acid will turn litmus paper red. So we can see what it would be for us to use the expression acid subject to those reason relations of implication. But if we do that, if we use that empirically descriptive expression, we're making ourselves vulnerable normatively by our own lights to what actually follows from what, subjunctively, in the real world. Because I can run across something that tastes sour and turns litmus paper blue. And those commitments are incompatible by my own lights. I'm inferentially committed to its being red, and I'm observationally, non-inferentially committed to its being blue. Those are, by my lights, incompatible. I'm obliged to change something. That's the world telling me that I can't have that concept, that I've incorporated in my normatively acknowledged reason relations an implication that does not hold in a subjunctively robust way. It's just not the case that if something tastes sour, then it turns litmus paper red. And that sort of friction is what I was talking about as sanding the rough edges off of the reason relations where they don't line up, where there isn't an isomorphism between them. And of course, we come late in a process of many applications of empirically descriptive concepts by many people, and that's why things work as well as they do. But of course, there isn't a perfect isomorphism. So I think Sellars has given us the raw materials to tell a conceptually realistic story that is a better story than, not just a subjective idealist story, but then the transcendental idealist story that he's inclined to tell. Now, if we had another couple sessions of the class, I'd like to revisit Sellars' negative metaphysics. Here, I've rejected, or at least offered what I take to be a more attractive alternative to his positive metaphysics, to his nominalism, to his seeing a world of particulars, or later on of pure processes, not properly thought of as particulars, but still broadly nominalistic picture. I've suggested that the conclusions that he drew in his positive metaphysics depend on this objectionable psychological restrictive conception of the conceptual, and that if we replace that with a rational structural conception of the conceptual, that we can do much better in our positive metaphysics. But he has all these brilliant, I think, meta-linguistic analyses of different kinds of expressions. Now, I've rejected his extrusion of alethic modality from the world, embraced a modal realism, the fine framework is a beautiful working out of that. I've rejected on that basis his extrusion of facts from the world. No, there are propositions in the world, and so if we drill down below the level of sentences, there's going to be properties and relations as well. Now, that's disagreeing with him fairly seriously, because if you recall, my account of Sellars' epiphany, what converted him to what he called the new way of words, sometime in 1947, I think, was his realization that he could redescribe what Carnap is doing, even though Carnap doesn't describe what he's doing this way, as offering us a new conception of Kantian categories, Kantian categorial concepts, where Sellars understood Kant's categories as his discovery that in addition to concepts whose job it is to predict and explain empirical goings-on, ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, in addition to vocabulary that has that expressive role, there's other vocabulary whose distinctive expressive role it is to make explicit features of the framework within which alone the application of empirically descriptive concepts is possible. And paradigmatic among those are alethic modal expressions. Sellars saw a way to make Kantian categorial concepts respectable as metalinguistic, and he took that thought, took that bit in his teeth and ran with it. And I don't think that there's nothing to it. I think he gives us wonderful accounts of what we're doing when we use alethic modal statements to formulate laws of nature, use subjunctive conditionals to state alethic consequence relations, use declarative sentences to state facts, to commit ourselves to truth of propositions, use singular terms to refer to objects or particulars, predicates to refer to properties and relations. Well, I should say, he's given us a good account of the relation between facts and the activity of asserting or claiming laws or subjunctively robust worldly connections and inferences, explanatory inferences, singular terms and the activity of referring, predicates and predicating as classifying, and so on. But all of that is in a pragmatic metavocabulary for talking in normative terms about what we're doing when we use those expressions. What we can see now is that doesn't preclude the truth of those analyses, doesn't preclude the intelligibility of our, by doing those things, saying of the objective world that there are subjunctively robust relations, there are facts, propositions, incompatibilities, and so on. The Wolbel isomorphism shows us how doing those things can be saying the things specifiable in a fine type semantic and metaphysical theory. What I haven't talked about or even gestured at here is what all that means for terms introduced by abstraction. I think those terms are not categorical terms. We're going to tell a different story about that, but I'm not going to tell it here. I'm skeptical about Sellars' insidious ontological demotion of abstracta, but more thought is needed on that point, so much being so little time. But perhaps we've brought things to the point over these 14 weeks that others can walk further down that path, even though we've reached the end of our journey together here. But thank you. I hope we've all learned something